What happens to the fundamental human survival instinct when you willingly lock yourself inside a completely unventilated, hand-riveted aluminum coffin, strap a chemically supercharged missile engine just inches from your fragile spine, and prepare to fire yourself blindly across a desolate prehistoric salt lake? Close your eyes and transport your mind to one of the most unforgiving and alien landscapes on the face of the earth. Picture the sheer, blinding white expanse of the Bonneville salt flats in the dead heat of summer. The temperature is hovering well above 100 degrees, and the sprawling salt crust heavily reflects the scorching midday sun with the terrifying, unyielding intensity of a giant magnifying glass aimed directly at your retinas. The heat is so intense that the air itself is violently boiling, creating massive, deeply disorienting optical mirages that make the distant, jagged mountains look as if they are mysteriously floating in the sky. Standing completely alone in the absolute center of this deeply hostile, blindingly white canvas is a mechanical monstrosity that defies every single conventional rule of motorcycle design. It possesses no exposed handlebars, no visible rubber tires, no standard foot pegs, and absolutely no place for a human being to sit upright. It is a completely enclosed, hyper-aerodynamic teardrop of highly polished aerospace aluminum that genuinely looks more like a highly classified military ballistic missile than a two-wheeled racing vehicle. This is the intensely captivating, deeply terrifying story of the absolute pinnacle of extreme land speed racing. It is the incredible narrative of a completely bespoke, garage-built speed record motorcycle that was so radically engineered, so relentlessly uncompromising in its singular pursuit of absolute terminal velocity, that it violently turned against its own genius creator and almost completely erased him from human existence. When you look at this highly reflective silver bullet, you are not simply looking at a unique weekend hobby project. You are staring directly at a deeply personal, entirely consuming psychological obsession made physically manifest in cold, highly unforgiving metal. It is an unapologetic machine specifically designed to violently pierce through the heavy, invisible atmospheric wall of the Earth at speeds that physically distort human vision. But ask yourself this: why would a rational human being dedicate his entire adult life, completely drain every single cent of his personal savings, and entirely isolate himself from society just to build a machine that credentialed aerospace engineers mathematically guaranteed would kill him? To fully comprehend the sheer, unadulterated madness and the deeply terrifying scope of this specific endeavor, you must first intimately understand the horrifying physical reality of what it actually takes to push a heavy, two-wheeled vehicle significantly past the 300-mile-per-hour barrier. At those incomprehensible, terrifying velocities, the atmospheric air itself completely changes its fundamental properties. It ceases to be an invisible, breathable gas that gently flows around you, and it instantly violently transforms into a remarkably solid, virtually impenetrable wall of dense kinetic resistance. If a highly experienced rider were to somehow attempt to sit completely upright on a standard, factory-built superbike at 300 miles per hour, the sheer, immense aerodynamic drag would violently tear them straight off the padded seat, aggressively snapping their neck before their limp body even had a chance to violently hit the abrasive ground. The solitary, deeply obsessed inventor intimately understood this terrifying aerodynamic reality better than anyone alive. He knew with absolute certainty that to shatter the ultimate world speed record, he had to completely and ruthlessly eliminate the fragile human aerodynamic factor from the equation entirely. He could not just simply ride the heavily modified motorcycle. He had to physically, psychologically, and literally become an internal organ of the massive machine. He entirely retreated into the absolute, echoing isolation of his dark, cluttered workshop, completely ignoring the arrogant mockery of wealthy, corporate-backed racing teams. He spent thousands upon thousands of agonizing, sleepless hours meticulously designing a completely enclosed aerodynamic shell known as a streamliner. He painstakingly hand-formed the outer metallic skin from incredibly thin aircraft-grade aluminum, meticulously hammering, rolling, and polishing every single square inch to fiercely ensure there were absolutely no drag-inducing imperfections. Have you ever wondered what absolute claustrophobia actually feels like when combined with the terrifying realization that you have absolutely no emergency bailout option? This relentless, uncompromising pursuit of absolute perfect aerodynamics required a deeply horrifying, entirely unacceptable compromise regarding human comfort. Basic psychological sanity and fundamental survival. The internal cockpit he eventually designed was so unbelievably tight, so completely physically restricted, that he literally could not even turn his helmeted head a fraction of an inch once he was finally strapped inside. He had to lie almost entirely flat on his heavily bruised back. His racing-booted feet aggressively pushed far forward into the dark nose cone to operate the highly complex shifting mechanisms, and his arms painfully pinned tightly against his ribcage while holding onto tiny, incredibly sensitive steering toggles. He was, for all practical intents and purposes, willingly locking himself directly into a custom-machined metal coffin. He was entirely surrounded by hundreds of pounds of highly explosive racing fuel, a massive, heavily supercharged internal combustion engine screaming just mere inches from the fragile base of his skull, and two incredibly narrow, heavily pressurized tires operating at the absolute razor edge of their structural integrity. There was absolutely no mechanical bailout option. There was no explosive ejection seat. If the heavy machine accidentally caught fire during a run, or if it violently lost its delicate gyroscopic balance at maximum terminal velocity, he was completely, hopelessly trapped inside a high-speed, tumbling blender of violently tearing metal and burning fuel. Yet, he completely detached from his own evolutionary survival instincts as he lay tightly strapped inside the pitch-black aluminum fuselage. The blindingly bright white glare of the sprawling salt flats entirely blocked out by the thick metal skin. The deafening, heavy silence inside his heavily padded racing helmet was almost significantly heavier and more oppressive than the impending noise of the engine. When he finally gave the muffled radio command to fire the massive power plant, the entire incredibly long aluminum shell violently shuddered. The entirely custom-built engine violently roared to life, aggressively vibrating against his spine with the terrifying force of a localized earthquake. The ambient temperature inside the unventilated, completely sealed cockpit immediately began to spike to highly dangerous levels. The intense, radiant heat literally baking him alive inside his heavy fire-retardant racing suit. But how do you mentally process extreme speed when you are completely blind to the outside world, save for a tiny, heavily scratched microscopic window positioned directly in front of your sweating eyes? The initial forward acceleration of the heavy streamliner was absolutely not the sudden, violently neck-snapping violence of a drag racing motorcycle. It was a relentless, incredibly terrifying buildup of pure kinetic energy that physically felt exactly like being tightly strapped directly to the front grille of a massive, runaway freight train. As the incredibly heavy machine slowly but aggressively gained forward momentum, the heavy aluminum shell began to efficiently slice cleanly through the dense desert air. The terrifying sound of the massive engine smoothly shifted from a guttural roar to a deeply piercing, incredibly high-altitude jet turbine whine. 100 miles per hour came and went entirely unnoticed. 200 miles per hour physically felt like a relatively gentle, entirely manageable cruise. But the sprawling salt flats, completely devoid of any natural visual reference points, created a terrifying, deeply disorienting sensory deprivation effect within his mind. Because the ground rushing beneath him was blindingly white and completely featureless, the inventor had absolutely no accurate visual sensation of his actual terrifying speed. The absolute only physical indicator was the violent, high-frequency kinetic vibration aggressively transferring through the solid metal chassis directly into his bones, and the incredibly fast, highly erratic bouncing of the small analog tachometer needle. As he violently crossed the highly anticipated 300-mile-per-hour mark, the absolute physical reality of his highly dangerous situation became horrifyingly apparent. At well over 300 miles per hour, the specialized, incredibly narrow motorcycle tires were expanding dangerously due to massive centrifugal force, their outer rubber edges stretching perilously closer to the incredibly sharp aluminum bodywork. The immense aerodynamic pressure violently pushing down heavily on the sleek nose of the streamliner calculated into thousands upon thousands of pounds of invisible crushing atmospheric force. The solitary inventor was no longer simply steering the heavy motorcycle. He was actively making completely microscopic, millimeter-precise muscular corrections just to keep the incredibly heavy aerodynamic bullet perfectly balanced on its absolute razor-thin edge. He was physically traveling the entire length of a massive football field every single solitary second, entirely floating on a highly unstable cushion of superheated air. What exactly happens when absolute, meticulously calculated aerodynamic perfection suddenly and without any warning transforms into a completely uncontrollable, violently fatal nightmare in the exact span of a single terrified heartbeat? Imagine physically traveling at a heavily documented 345 miles per hour, completely locked inside a dark metal coffin with absolutely no ability to move your arms or legs, when you suddenly feel the absolute worst possible sensation a high-speed rider can ever experience: a sudden, terrifying, complete lack of friction. The sprawling Bonneville salt flats are absolutely not perfectly smooth engineered surfaces. They are a living, breathing geological surface, and occasionally they harbor highly dangerous, hidden microscopic pockets of loose, powdery salt that act exactly like invisible black ice on a frozen winter highway. The incredibly fast streamliner hit one of these completely microscopic, entirely invisible patches of loose salt at absolutely maximum velocity. The rear racing tire, furiously spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute to maintain the massive forward thrust, instantly and violently lost its highly critical traction. The incredibly heavy aerodynamic back end of the streamliner aggressively kicked out sharply to the right, at a terrifying 345 miles per hour. A slight rear-end fishtail is absolutely not a correctable minor driving error. It is an immediate, catastrophic, mathematically guaranteed death sentence. The inventor's rapidly beating heart violently slammed against his rib cage as he instinctively applied a completely microscopic counter-steering input to the tiny toggles, desperately trying to physically wrestle the heavy oscillating machine back into a perfectly straight line. But it was incredibly far too late for human reflexes to save him. The highly specialized aerodynamic profile of the custom streamliner, which was perfectly designed to slice cleanly through the heavy air while pointed straight ahead, suddenly and violently caught the massive, solid wall of dense atmospheric wind completely on its broad, flat side. It was exactly like violently opening an incredibly massive heavy parachute completely sideways at the speed of sound. The immense, absolutely terrifying thousands of pounds of sheer aerodynamic pressure instantly and aggressively flipped the incredibly heavy motorcycle completely violently onto its side. The deafening, high-pitched screaming whine of the engine was immediately replaced by the absolute horrifying, deeply apocalyptic sound of heavily tearing metal, snapping titanium, and disintegrating aluminum aggressively grinding against the hard-packed prehistoric salt. Have you ever considered what the absolute limits of the fragile human skeleton are when subjected to the chaotic, high-velocity atmospheric disintegration of a perfectly engineered racing machine? The subsequent utterly horrifying crash was absolutely not a simple racing slide. It was a completely violent, entirely chaotic tumbling sequence that defied human comprehension. The heavy streamliner, traveling significantly faster than a large commercial passenger airliner at maximum takeoff velocity, violently dug its sleek nose directly deep into the hard salt surface, entirely vaulting its incredibly heavy, engine-filled tail section high into the bright blue air. It immediately began a terrifying, violently erratic end-over-end tumbling sequence that physically lasted for an agonizing eternity. The sheer, unadulterated violence of the massive rotational velocity subjected the frail inventor's body to completely unimaginable, aggressively bone-crushing gravitational forces. He was violently and repeatedly thrown against the heavy solid steel roll cage inside the pitch-dark cockpit, his tightly secured safety harnesses violently digging into his fragile shoulders, aggressively attempting to keep his human body from being completely torn apart. The incredibly beautiful, meticulously handcrafted aluminum shell was violently peeled away like a completely discarded cheap tin can, completely exposing the raw, highly vulnerable internal mechanics to the abrasive rushing salt surface. The incredibly massive custom billet aluminum engine block, subjected to absolutely impossible kinetic twisting forces, violently ripped completely free from its heavy steel mounts, heavily tumbling across the desolate desert floor entirely on its own, entirely spewing highly volatile, superheated toxic racing fuel in every possible chaotic direction. The completely unrecognizable heavy streamliner violently tumbled for well over an entire mile, violently bouncing incredibly high off the hard salt surface, completely shedding incredibly heavy custom machined parts with every single loud impact. When the completely crushed, totally unrecognizable lump of heavily smoking, entirely destroyed metal finally came to a complete, terrifying grinding halt. An incredibly eerie, deeply unsettling dead silence instantly fell over the massive sprawling salt flats. The massive crowd, standing miles away in the designated pit area, had watched the entire horrifying spectacle slowly unfold through their long-range binoculars, completely paralyzed and utterly frozen by absolute, deeply visceral terror. The long, incredibly violent trail of completely destroyed wreckage stretched as far as the human eye could physically see, a deeply terrifying permanent scar violently carved directly into the previously pristine white surface. How does a man trapped upside down in a crushed, fuel-soaked metal cage entirely process the terrifying realization that a single microscopic spark of static electricity will instantly turn his prison into an inescapable crematorium? Now place yourself directly inside the completely crushed, entirely unrecognizable remnants of that highly claustrophobic cockpit. You are hanging entirely upside down, completely and painfully suspended solely by the heavy, deeply cutting straps of your frayed safety harness. The intense, absolutely burning, deeply toxic smell of highly explosive leaking aviation racing fuel heavily permeates the cramped, crushed space, and you can clearly hear the absolute terrifying rhythmic dripping of the volatile liquid heavily splashing directly onto the still superheated glowing red exhaust headers. Your fragile human body is completely and utterly shattered, beyond any recognizable comprehension. Both of your incredibly broken legs are violently crushed entirely under the completely collapsed heavy metal steering column. Your fragile collarbone is completely snapped entirely in half, and the heavy, absolutely agonizing, blinding weight of a highly severe brain concussion makes it entirely impossible to keep your bleeding eyes fully open. You desperately try to loudly scream for emergency help, but your completely dry mouth is entirely packed tight with highly abrasive, violently suffocating dry white salt. You are entirely alone, deeply trapped incredibly deep inside the completely mangled corpse of your own incredibly proud mechanical creation, fully anticipating the highly fiery explosion that will finally end your immense physical suffering. But the violent explosion entirely never comes. Instead, after what physically feels like thousands of complete lifetimes of utterly agonizing pain, you faintly hear the highly desperate crunch of heavy emergency boots violently running across the hard salt. The heavily equipped trained emergency rescue teams completely and violently tear directly into the twisted metal wreckage with incredibly heavy hydraulic jaws of life, aggressively ripping the completely crushed steel roll cage apart, just to carefully extract your completely broken, heavily bleeding limp body from the smoking wreckage. You are immediately airlifted directly to the nearest highly equipped trauma medical center, completely hovering perilously on the absolute brink of total irreversible cardiac failure. Your utterly destroyed body a completely ruined canvas of massive shattered bone fractures and intense friction burns. So how exactly does a brilliant mechanical genius, whose completely shattered skeleton is now permanently held together by massive invasive titanium plates and surgical metal screws, respond when professional trauma surgeons explicitly tell him that his entirely miraculous survival was a highly impossible statistical anomaly and that he must permanently abandon his suicidal obsession with ultimate speed? The highly educated medical experts who meticulously pieced his shattered body back together firmly told him, without any hesitation, that he would entirely spend many long agonizing months completely encased in an incredibly heavy restrictive full-body plaster cast. They mathematically guaranteed that he would absolutely require numerous highly invasive surgeries just to simply learn how to painfully walk again. But the completely irrational, deeply obsessed human mind operates on an entirely different frequency when it gets violently slapped down by the absolute fundamental laws of physics. As the entirely broken inventor lay completely immobilized in his highly sterile hospital bed, heavily pumped completely full of highly powerful mind, numbing narcotic painkillers, completely encased in incredibly heavy white plaster from his entirely crushed chest down to his shattered toes, he did not entirely feel a single microscopic ounce of gratitude for his entirely miraculous survival. He did absolutely not feel an entirely overwhelming sense of relief that he had completely cheated the Grim Reaper. He entirely felt something completely, utterly different. He felt completely, violently, entirely enraged. He was entirely furious at the absolutely microscopic, completely invisible patch of loose, treacherous salt. He was deeply angry at the completely unexpected aerodynamic instability of the entirely heavy aluminum tail section. He was profoundly frustrated that his completely beloved machine had entirely failed him, just mere agonizing miles entirely away from securing the absolute ultimate untouchable world record. He completely did not ask his entirely grieving family for any sympathy or comfort. He entirely looked completely past his weeping wife, completely stared directly at his exhausted crew chief, and weakly demanded a highly fresh blank notebook and an incredibly heavy black drawing pen. With his entirely one completely unbroken, violently trembling hand, fighting fiercely through the suffocating haze of powerful narcotics, he immediately began furiously sketching out the entirely new, completely radically improved aerodynamic profile for the entirely next highly anticipated streamliner. He completely realized in that profoundly dark moment that the incredibly violent catastrophic crash was absolutely not a highly violent terrifying warning from the absolute universe to entirely stop. It was incredibly valuable, highly destructive, completely priceless aerodynamic telemetry data. He now completely understood exactly how the completely dense air violently behaved at exactly 345 miles per hour. Purely because he had entirely physically felt it violently tear his highly beloved machine entirely apart piece by piece. What profound level of unyielding psychological determination does it take to willingly crawl right back into the exact same terrifying mechanical nightmare that previously shattered your entire existence, just to answer a single lingering mathematical question? This is the completely unparalleled, deeply terrifying reality of the completely obsessed men who willingly dedicate their entirely finite lives to endlessly chasing the completely absolute unreachable land speed record. They absolutely do not operate entirely within the completely normal rational bounds of basic fundamental human self-preservation. They entirely view completely catastrophic mechanical failure, violently broken bones, and absolutely terrifying near-death experiences as absolutely nothing more than completely temporary, incredibly painful physical inconveniences entirely located on the incredibly long isolated road to absolute ultimate uncompromising mechanical perfection. The incredibly fast speed record bike that almost completely killed its own highly brilliant inventor absolutely did not entirely break his incredibly stubborn, unyielding mechanical spirit. It completely baptized him entirely in a violently hot, incredibly high-speed fire of entirely twisted aluminum and highly burning toxic salt. It completely stripped away any lingering human fear of violent death and entirely replaced it with an incredibly cold, entirely calculating, and deeply terrifying mathematical obsession. Many agonizing years later, completely walking heavily with a highly severe permanent physical limp, that exact same entirely unbroken inventor completely rolled an entirely new, heavily modified, vastly superior streamliner entirely out onto the exact same completely blindingly white, unforgiving salt flats. He willingly climbed right back entirely into the completely dark, claustrophobic, unventilated cockpit, completely allowed his highly loyal crew to firmly bolt the entirely heavy metal canopy shut, plunging him entirely back into the completely terrifying absolute darkness, and violently fired the incredibly massive screaming engine entirely one more glorious time. He completely willingly strapped himself entirely back into the exact same violent, terrifying mechanical nightmare that had almost entirely destroyed him physically, completely pushing the entirely new, highly modified machine significantly past the absolute highly terrifying speed that had previously almost completely killed him, entirely, violently shattering the absolute ultimate world record and completely forever cementing his entirely terrifying, deeply inspirational legacy in the completely permanent annals of absolute extreme motorsport history. The entirely captivating story of this completely terrifying, uncompromising machine is absolutely not simply a highly basic cautionary tale about the immense physical dangers of incredibly high speed. It is a completely profoundly dark, incredibly inspiring psychological study of the absolute terrifying lengths a deeply brilliant, obsessed human mind will completely and willingly go to violently conquer the deeply unforgiving, entirely absolute laws of natural physics. It completely proves that for a very specific, deeply insane breed of completely solitary mechanical genius, the absolutely terrifying constant threat of completely violent total destruction is absolutely nothing entirely compared to the completely unbearable agonizing agony of completely leaving a single highly lingering mathematical question completely unanswered. You completely realize that true absolute greatness in the completely terrifying highly extreme world of entirely absolute speed is absolutely not simply measured by completely how fast you can ultimately go, but by exactly how many absolute times you are entirely willing to let the highly violent machine completely break your incredibly fragile human body entirely before you finally bend the highly violent, entirely uncompromising forces of nature completely to your absolutely iron unbreakable will.